Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today's show is going to be on the news, specifically a lot of the changes that are going on at CNN, the direction of CNN, and Chris Licht, who was recently fired from the news network. So with us today, we have Meg James from the LA Times. Meg, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So could you just introduce yourself and how long you've been in journalism and the beat you're covering, and specifically why you decided to get into the work that you're doing?
Yes, I am a corporate media reporter at the Los Angeles Times. I'm part of our company town team, which covers the business of entertainment. I've been doing this now for nearly 22 years. And honestly, I think it's one of the most exciting and dynamic beats at the LA Times, because if you are covering Hollywood in Los Angeles, I mean, what else would you want to be covering?
It's a very exciting beat. I mean, the intersection of Hollywood and wealthy people and business and politics. So Meg, everybody has read, I assume everybody's read your story on Chris Licht. There was also a Tim Alberta article in The Atlantic. Those were the two major stories that I myself dug into. And those came out before Chris Licht was fired. So could you just give us a rundown of what the heck happened and why Chris was fired?
Yes, I mean, this is part of an ongoing story here in Hollywood about Warner Brothers Discovery, which is the parent company of CNN. And CNN for the last 5 years has really tried to operate within two things were going on. One was you had Donald Trump's presidency, but you also had two successive different ownership groups for CNN. And those corporate, entities had different priorities. What we've seen originally in 2018, it was then called Time Warner. It was sold to AT&T, which really wanted to use the entertainment company and the news network, CNN, to build its cell phone business and data subscribers. After a few years in Hollywood, AT&T decided this is not a business that they wanted to be part of. The losses that the large media companies are incurring for their streaming operations have been in the billions. And AT&T decided it wanted to sell what it was calling Warner Media. And along came Discovery, a smaller cable programming operation that had big ambitions. And Discovery bought Warner Media a year ago. And the CEO of Warner Media Discovery, now it's called Warner Brothers Discovery, the CEO has some real firm opinions on CNN and how it was alienating audiences to the right. So under Warner Brothers Discovery and David Zaslav, the long time executive who's run Discovery, for 15 years now, they have been trying to sort of shift more to the middle. And that was Chris Licht's marching orders. He came in a year ago and he was trying to sort of make CNN more palatable for viewers who might have, bought into Donald Trump's slogan that CNN was fake news. So they've been trying really hard to steer the ship what they think would be more to the center. Now, there is existential questions for a news organization about upholding the truth. And, I think that reasonable people can disagree on what CNN's tone was under the Chris Licht's predecessor, Jeff Zucker. And I think that there's a lot of room for argument and interpretation.
This has been a conundrum for CNN that has no perfect answer, no perfect solution. Some think CNN made it worse by letting Chris interview his brother when COVID-19 was ravaging New York. But that was an unprecedented time period. And so is this one. A famous family in the news, a governor who soared to the highest heights last year, now falling to the lowest lows, self-inflicted wounds, and a brother who just wants to do his job, just wants to anchor his show.
without going into Jeff Zucker's term, I think that a lot of people can disagree with almost how it ended, right? Where Andrew Cuomo was being interviewed by Chris Cuomo, and then Brian Stelter was covering the whole thing through a, many would argue, very rosy CNN, pro CNN lens. So when Chris Licht took over, I was extremely happy because I thought, oh, maybe we're going to revert back to the truth and have a new direction at the network. But it's come out that from your reporting, from other reporting, that when he took over, he almost took a hostile approach to the talent in a direct opposite way than Mr. Zucker did. Can you get into what type of negative consequences there are from taking maybe a hostile approach? And if you can really be successful, if you're running one of these massive organizations and you're not getting along with the people that are paid more than you and maybe the most in the organization.
Yes, and a shout out to my colleague Steve Battaglio, who's done also a lot of really strong work on CNN, and Chris Licht. When Chris came in, he had a really strong track record of 3 shows that he was instrumental in really boosting. And the most recent of which, I mean, first it was Morning Joe on MSNBC, very successful morning show. Then he went to CBS and he helped CBS sort of redefine its mornings away from the more fluffy news and a more serious journalism. And it really was making strong gains, actually, sadly, until after the Me Too movement and Charlie Rose was forced out of the network. And then no Me Too allegations here regarding Chris Licht, but he went to work with Stephen Colbert on CBS's Late Show and really, really helped Stephen find an audience being Stephen. So Chris Licht came in with a tremendous amount of skill and success in television, but now he was charged with not running a show, but running an incredible, thousands of people in this organization around the world. And it appears that, in retrospect, that it might have been too, steep a hill to climb. I mean, one of the things that his predecessor, Jeff Zucker, was beloved amongst many of the CNN talent, and he was very talent friendly. And when Chris came in, he was not viewed as being as a personable or as adroit at all of the programming moves that Jeff Zucker had excelled in. So he came in. Also, there were a lot of people at CNN last year that were really aggrieved by Jeff Zucker's departure. They felt that he was forced out for reasons that he shouldn't have been. Now, you can argue with that. I mean, Jeff Zucker's departure was because he was having a consensual affair, but an affair nonetheless with an underling, which in most corporations is a big no-no. So, and Jeff Zucker has even said that, he, gave AT&T the ammunition to get rid of him. But he departed about 2 months before this merger, which brought the new Discovery management in, and Chris Licht came in, and he definitely had a mission that he and David Zaslav agreed to about how CNN's tone needed to be changed and more modulated.
Meg, did you think that Zucker's departure was under kind of a pretextual explanation? As you described, the relationship that he had at CNN was a consensual one, and there were maybe some indications that AT&T knew that the new Discovery team that were coming in didn't really share Zucker's vision. The CNN Plus initiative seemed like it was not there for the long haul. Do you think that maybe AT&T and Discovery wanted to get rid of Zucker and kind of came up with an explanation for why they did it?
Actually, no. I think that's a popular theory, and on the surface, it looks like it might have some weight to it. But David Zaslav worked with Jeff Zucker at NBC, and they were friends. And while I think that AT&T getting rid of Jeff Zucker actually solved a problem for David Zaslav, that wasn't his intent. I do think that AT&T firing Jeff Zucker was increasingly we're finding out more about Chris Cuomo's exit and some of the really inappropriate contact between the CNN brass and Chris Cuomo's brother, Andrew Cuomo, the coverage of Andrew Cuomo, and also Chris Cuomo's departure from CNN. So I think that there were a lot of things that there were a lot of confluence of factors. I don't think, and actually AT&T and Discovery had a pretty contentious sort of marriage last year. Discovery was not happy last year because they felt like AT&T wasn't providing enough visibility into the business. So it's kind of a stretch to say like, well, Discovery was complaining that they weren't getting visibility into the business. They were also in cahoots with AT&T to get rid of Jeff Zucker. I don't think that there's evidence to support that. I think what happened, though, was that the firing of Jeff Zucker did, in a weird way, sort of alleviate a problem. But I fully think, and our reporting, suggests that David Zaslav was looking forward to having some type of a relationship with Jeff Zucker when he came in to run this big new company.
With the way that they're portrayed as handling talent or dealing with their on-air talent, Zucker and Licht, it seems like polar opposites. From your experience reporting in corporate media, is there a one-size-fits-all approach, or is there a way that these media bosses in these large companies typically approach talent? And if so, what does that look like?
That's a great question. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think that some of the more successful managers, you look at the Bob Igers and some of the, throughout history, the executives who do the best really recognize that talent relations is part of their job. And it's a really tricky part of their job because, they might have to get rid of these people at some point, but they also want to make sure that the talent, particularly creative talents, are providing, at their, they're sort of excelling at a high level. So no, I don't think there's a one size fits all approach, but I think that the issue here was also that Chris came in with a few strikes against him that were not of his making. One was the departure of Jeff Zucker. And, who knows? David Zaslav and Jeff Zucker might have come to some sort of agreement that Jeff would go, several months later. Who knows? We really don't know because of Jeff Zucker was fired in February of 2022. There was also a really interesting segment on CNBC, the financial news network, by John Malone, this cable mogul who is very right-leaning. And he made a statement on CNBC about how CNN needed to have reporters more like Fox News, which for the CNN troops, that was like, their brains exploded. And so that, predated Jeff Zucker leaving. That was, months and months before Chris Licht was hired. So you have the CNN anchors and reporters and talent a little bit suspicious or a lot suspicious of the new managers. And what would it mean to sort of take CNN more in a direction that John Malone held out should be more like Fox News. So there were these huge sort of signals to the CNN talent and, the troops there that things were going to change, and, change isn't easy.
Meg, talking about Chris Licht's approach in this job, it's kind of interesting thinking about the long arc of his career and his other previous positions, because what we've heard about Chris Licht's career, especially his position at the Colbert Show, seems so different from the way that he approached this job. When we think about the Colbert Show, we think of maybe two things. One is that we've heard he had such a great relationship with Colbert, just like he did with Scarborough, great talent relationships. And the other is that they reoriented The Late Show into a pretty partisan, political, liberal-leaning program. And both of these factors, the close relationship with talent and the liberal political reputation, it's the opposite of what Licht tried to do at CNN. It seems like, how could this be the same person? So could you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, how did he do the job at the Colbert Show? What kind of person was he in that role? And how did it end up being the opposite from how he approached the next job at CNN?
I mean, from everything that our sources have told us, that Chris Licht was really well loved within CBS. He had a tremendous amount of success in the news division and on the Colbert Show. If you remember, and back when Donald Trump was running for office, the leader in the late night news wars was Jimmy Fallon over on NBC. And Jimmy made what a lot of people would say was a really bad move by jostling the hair of Donald Trump and kind of, bringing this aw shucks attitude to, Donald Trump's candidacy. And CBS was really smart. They saw that a lot of people were alienated from Fallon's show because of his embrace of Trump, who had, made a fortune and reestablished his credibility on NBC through The Apprentice, the reality TV show. So CBS with Chris Licht and Stephen Colbert said, let's just have Colbert be Colbert on and speak about, what he saw as what Colbert saw was the wrong direction that the country was going. I think what Chris Licht did there was really brilliant. They allowed Stephen Colbert to be political at a time when a lot of, CBS's former chief, years before had said he didn't know if Donald Trump was good for America, but he sure was good for CBS because of the ratings and the ad revenue. And so when Colbert came in, his first few months were rocky. And so I think that they made a really wise decision by just letting the talent be true to himself, in this case, Stephen Colbert. And I think Stephen Colbert loved and respected Chris Licht for that.
So Chris Licht was, it sounds like, loved and respected with the Colbert Show, like you just said. And then he comes into this, it almost sounds like a pit of vipers where the talent is upset. Not only that, there is a well-known pivot to the center, which inherently implies some criticism of the journalism work being done by that talent that is already upset. And he allows one of the hardest hitting feature profilers out there, Tim Alberta, to come in and almost have full access. Do we know why Chris Licht agreed to the profile with somebody that was certainly and surely not going to write a puff piece?
Well, I mean, I don't want to second guess the PR people who, incidentally, and not coincidentally, are no longer at CNN. But the way it's been described to me was that Tim Alberta, who's an incredible journalist and a political journalist, came to write a story about how Chris was going to try to make this pivot, which is an incredibly smart story to do. I mean, this CNN is a worldwide brand. It's part of the DNA of our political system. I mean, that is a political story as much as it is a media story. What I've heard was that Tim also was working on a book, so he wasn't spending like 12 months embedded, but he very, sharply attended some major events, including the Trump town hall on May 10th, I believe, which numerous sources within the company have told me that was the accelerant for the management at Warner Brothers Discovery to recognize, they had a May Day, Houston, we have a problem.
I will second guess, as a PR professional in political PR for large corporations, I would be fired if I ever allowed that to happen. So those PR folks definitely made a big boo-boo.
And also, that was not the first big profile that was written about Chris Licht. The New York Times also profiled him, a much more glowing article months earlier. So, and a really respected writer at the New York Times did a very good profile talking about the challenges, the Jeff Zucker leaving, the sort of the wariness of the CNN, talent. I keep saying talent. I think that's the best way. There's reporters, it's anchors, it's the whole producers and the whole gamut. But so it does look like Chris Licht was trying to court favorable publicity because, he was, I'm guessing, trying to, just sort of reinforce his bona fides as a newsman and as a leader of this organization and of somebody that could be reckoned with, somebody and this is one of the things that was interesting in the Atlantic piece, which I thought was an amazing piece of journalism, is that Chris Licht almost seemed weirdly obsessive with Jeff Zucker in the piece. And, that obviously did not play well.
Meg, just like you've said, this spate of profiles, including the one of the Atlantic, it really raised Chris Licht's public profile, and it also transformed his reputation. And now this episode, this experience at CNN, it's certainly going to be the first sentence in his biography at this point. And it's drawn into question some of the things that he was known for doing very successfully, like morning television programming. So it leaves us to wonder, what's Chris going to do next? Where is there to go? Back to TV producing? Can he do that? Or is his reputation too damaged by what happened? What do you think is next for Chris Licht?
On a human level, feel bad for somebody because Chris is I haven't spent a lot of time with him, but he's someone who I respected and continue to respect. I feel like, people should not be judged by their worst decisions unless there's so many of them. But and he's in his early 50s, so I strongly suspect that he will have another career. Might not be right away, and it might not be at such a large organization, but I do feel like it's sad on a human level when somebody, excuse the pun, but flames out so spectacularly.
I mean, I would probably rather have the job myself producing Late Night with Colbert than trying to run CNN at a time of crisis, even before Chris Licht came in. So, I mean, maybe there's greener pastures in his next chapter.
Well, that's interesting that you said that because Stephen Colbert has gone on record to say he tried to tell, and this was actually, I think this was the reporting in the New York Times, was that he had told Chris, like, no, you don't want to go there. It's like, it's a mess. And I mean, here's the broader backdrop that we're all dealing with. I mean, media is really challenged right now. Streaming services, digital, have really upended, legacy platforms. And, readers and listeners are, dispersed, and everyone's trying to get enough traction with a large enough audience to be, sustaining itself. You also have, and, I don't think this was entirely Chris Licht's decision, but one of the things that the previous owners were trying to do was build this CNN Plus platform. And to build any new venture like that is it's cost prohibitive. And Warner Media spent hundreds of millions of dollars to start CNN Plus. But that was what they felt like was the play for the future. And when David Zaslav and Chris came in, they immediately, cut it. I mean, they just, all that work, hundreds of people's efforts was just gone. And that was also something that the Warner Discovery people were a little bit chagrined about after they had laid off that entire unit. Chris Licht told people, like, that's it for the layoffs. But it wasn't it, because a few months later, the whole Wall Street really soured on legacy media companies that have streaming operations. And the stocks of all these companies, from Paramount Global to Disney to Warner Brothers Discovery, have really been under pressure since last summer, because Wall Street is no longer showing any patience for big losses to build streaming services. So Chris Licht came in at a time when there were a lot of really big, huge shifts going on in media. And I just sort of feel like he got caught in, sort of these tectonic plates moving. And also by, being the subject of this really, what turned into a really critical look at him by the Atlantic.
I want to get into this discussion about whether there's a future for cable news at all, whether they can survive on streaming and so on. But I mean, I think the immediate question is really to try to figure out what Discovery and David Zaslav's vision for CNN is going to be, because we're talking about how Chris came in at a time when the company was changing hands. The new Discovery team had a completely different idea about what they wanted to do. They shut down the CNN Plus service. I worked with Discovery for 5 years on a TV channel startup, and I think I got a little bit of an idea for the way that they think, which is cheap, quick, and programming that is not going to last the test of time. And I think there's been some speculation that maybe Discovery and Zaslav are aiming to strip down CNN and maybe even all of Warner, but at least CNN, into something very light and inexpensive, and then maybe flip it to another media company. Do we have any indication, any real concrete indication that that might be their plan, or is it just speculation?
I think it's speculation. And I think that it's speculation because the trend in media has been big mergers to make, medium-sized companies bigger. And I think that when David Zaslav took over Warner Brothers Discovery, his intent wasn't to make things cheaper and, and faster. I mean, one of the things that David Zaslav really talked about at length before the merger was his love for Warner Brothers Pictures, the film studio. And this is an executive who has spent his whole life in the cable programming side. And so he was, and also HBO, was the gold standard, or is the gold standard in television. I mean, if there's Emmys this fall, then, we will see HBO cleaning up. This is an interesting point, John, and I think you're onto something in that they recently renamed the streaming service from HBO Max to just Max. And the reason why, they felt that the HBO mantle, that patina, was alienating to some people who saw it as an elite coastal brand. And so in an effort to appeal to the people who have been the Discovery, audiences for all these years, they're trying to sort of make Max seem like more of a regular Joe. Now, as far as, a spinoff or selling to another media company, that could happen. We don't know what the future is going to hold. I think that the bigger problem that David Zaslav has right now is the debt that they took on to pull off this merger. They had to pay the AT&T's shareholders a huge dividend, and they, took on nearly $50 billion in debt, including absorbing some of the debt that the company had, to be able to pull off that transaction. And so now they're looking at an economy that isn't as favorable to their cable channels. It isn't as favorable to the streaming platform. And they are facing huge debt payments to pay down this colossal debt, which is more than twice what the company is currently worth. So long term, how are they going to sustain high quality and also pay off the debt? And so I think that's what leads some people to conclude, like, oh, he's just trying to strip it down for a sale. If a sale happens, I don't think I would be entirely surprised, but it will be at least a year before anything like that happens.
Attention parents, what you're about to see is not suitable for kids. Shoot, it's not even suitable for some grown-ups. You might want to walk away now if you ain't into these type of things. I mean, the yard's got dead spots in it. I mean, it's growing up high. I mean, if you take more pride in the yard, maybe, might get a little more affection.
I do take pride in the yard.
So when you gonna fertilize it?
I will.
I mean,
hell, I'm trying to fertilize something. Maybe if Gene was a little bit more frisky, maybe I'd be motivated to get everything done around here.
Take care of the lawn and then we'll talk. Horny bear.
All right.
Horny ass damn bear.
Meg, just about the HBO Max to Max renaming. I mean, you mentioned how in some ways it's a bit of an insult at HBO to say that their brand isn't good enough for the mass market. But at the same time, I wonder if a lot of people at HBO are relieved about the renaming because the brand would have been degraded by being stamped on all this Discovery stuff that's going to come into the system. I'm imagining Honey Boo Boo and Deadliest Catch having the HBO logo on them. And I'm thinking of the horrified executives that have maintained HBO's status for reputation for quality for such a long time. So in a way, they've perhaps dodged a bullet by having it renamed.
I've had this conversation with so many people at Warner Discovery. And yes, you're right. Casey Bloys, who is the head of HBO, said that in some ways he was a bit relieved because, his responsibility is to, he programs the entire, the streaming service as well. But there was that concern. And he also pointed out that some of the same people who were decrying taking the HBO off the HBO Max brand and just renaming it Max were some of the same people who a year or so ago were saying, like, how could you possibly brand this, HBO when you're going to have, all of this other programming even before the Discovery merger. So yes, I think that it was a blessing and a curse.
And they're mad that the programming is coming off the streaming service. And they were also mad when stuff was coming out on streaming simultaneous to the cinema. So it's kind of like no matter what they announce, people are going to complain.
Warner Media then under AT&T stepped in it with their straight to streaming strategy during the pandemic. But, you have to step back and say, that the pandemic was an extraordinary event and movie theaters were closed and people didn't want to go to the cinema. So how long do you hold this product not knowing, when people would feel safe going back to theater? So I mean, it just shows you all of these different forces that make it incredibly difficult to be a leader of a media company right now.
So Meg, I want to get into some of these forces and get your take on maybe why they're happening. So we all know that people are cutting cords, and as a result, there are declines in all types of viewership metrics. Even regional sports broadcasting networks, for example, are experiencing this. They're going out of business, and it's a massive problem for Major League Baseball to the point where they may have to broadcast their own games as a league. But more specifically, back to CNN, they have also experienced a precipitous drop in viewership, and it can't all be to cord cutting and folks just, taking a different avenue, because as CNN's losing viewers, you have MSNBC increasing in their viewers and their share, and Newsmax now, I think, depending on the night and the show, has Newsmax, which is crap. It's misinformation, disinformation, prejudice. It's now overtaking CNN. Do we have any idea of what is behind this massive drop in viewers for a once idealized and basically the epitome of cable news?
Oh, there's so many factors for this. And so let's talk one of the main ones, I think, is just viewer fatigue. Think about, when Biden, took the oath of office and Trump went away. It was, a couple weeks after January 6th, and people were just exhausted. And I think that the ratings for the cable news networks across the board reflected the fact that they didn't have to be tuned in to, CNBC or watch the 11th hour on MSNBC every night because Biden was boring, and then, just like, I can take a breath and, watch Stranger Things or Succession or something like that. So you have that going on. You also had this really public pronouncement that CNN was going to go back to the middle of the road. I mean, I've been covering media for 2 decades now, and CNN has been struggling for years because when there's a major news event, their ratings go crazy because people still see them as a trusted source of news. They also have an unparalleled international network and business that the other news networks don't have. And they need to maintain that business, and credibility is key. So I think that you had, it's just sort of exhaustion among the viewers. You had people that were outflanking them. I mean, yes, Newsmax is doing better than CNN on some nights. And that's really terrifying for the Warner Brothers Discovery folks. Now, incidentally, that's another reason why I think Chris Licht got a little bit in the crosshairs of his bosses, too. You also had the situation where Chris Licht, one of his first and biggest priorities was recreating CNN's morning show. And they took Don Lemon off the prime time. They put him in the morning show. And we know how that ended, not well. And basically, he did not, according to some company insiders, devote sufficient attention to rebuilding CNN's prime time. But you also have this inherent problem that CNN is going to face that MSNBC and Fox News and Newsmax and the others don't have, is if they're trying to be just the facts and, straight down the middle of the road, it's not going to be what the primetime viewers tune in for. On Fox News, they tune in for the red meat, liberal bashing and, what's wrong, with all these, libs and the woke and all of that. And on MSNBC, they're bringing their own, sort of a perspective on the political from a left leaning view. So if CNN's going to go down the middle, the middle of the road people might be more content to watch, Abbott Elementary or Young Sheldon or Game of Thrones, reruns. Part of the reason why Fox News and MSNBC have done better is because they are playing to a very specific audience. And the audience that CNN is trying to attract is not we'll tune in every night to be whipped up and have somebody tell us that, we're smart because this is the way we think politically. And that's what people are getting on some of these other channels. It's very tribal, and CNN faces, obstacles in retaining audience if it doesn't want to, subscribe to any of the particular political tribes that, our country is fractured by.
The way you described it was great, and it just brought vivid imagery to my mind where on the left at MSNBC, you have them screaming that Ron DeSantis is a fascist, and on the right, you had Tucker Carlson, who many would argue is a legitimate fascist, screaming about the wokies and the lefties and, everything that he doesn't like. And you can see why people would tune into that. Now, I personally used to be a daily CNN viewer. We work in politics and all that. Like you mentioned, the fatigue got to me, so I would rather read an article by Meg James in the LA Times, by James Pindell in the Boston Globe, maybe the New York Times, and then tune out as opposed to spend hours and hours and hours and hours going into the breach again. So that leads me to my question. If we don't think that there's actually commercial viability for the pivot to the center, which you alluded to in your previous answer, could anybody have survived and thrived in the role that Chris Licht was stuck into? And the second part of that is David Zaslav committed to this pivot to the center, even as ratings continue to decline?
I mean, those are the questions. Could Chris Licht had survived without the Atlantic article? And I don't know because, from my reporting, that the brass at Warner Discovery recognized they had a huge problem with the Trump debate. We can talk about the problems of the Trump debate, but I think that anyone in the current environment that's trying to be opinion free, particularly in the evening hours, is going to find it tough sledding because the people who are tuning in at night for the political sort of opinions want their own opinions to be reinforced. And that's the magic ingredient that the others that are doing better in the prime time have glommed onto, is that they're giving the audience what they want.
Meg, you teased something there that I'm very curious about. How did David Zaslav react to the Trump town hall? What was his take on it?
I don't know exactly. I don't want to I don't want to misrepresent what I know, but I do know that internally they recognized that it was a huge problem. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons why was, for folks that watched it, it looked like a Trump rally. The crowd was so pro-Trump and cheering. One of the reasons why the people internally, the reporters and anchors in CNN were horrified. Caitlin Collins is, a young CNN talent. Trump called her a nasty person. I mean, from a reporter's standpoint, I mean, that's a very lonely stage to be on when, somebody is telling the entire audience you're a nasty person. And it looked like CNN just left her out there to try to fend off Donald Trump's very predictable behavior. I think that the other thing that really sort of sealed it was when Christiane Amanpour at Columbia University said that she very much disagreed with the decision to give Donald Trump that type of platform. So when you have one of your most respected journalists talking to others and journalists in a very public setting, calling out the management, that is not good. It's so I think that there were a number of factors. And then also look at the ratings. It didn't do particularly well. So all of this capital of trying to, what some people might call pander to the right, or at least, come across as being more middle of the road, really didn't provide the ratings that they would need to say, see, this is what we need to do. But herein, that's part of the problem is that, the people who are hardcore Donald Trump people probably still are going to find their safe space with Newsmax or, Fox News or some other, outlet, whether it be online or some other space. And you really have to wonder what they felt they were going to achieve by this. And I also think, to be fair to CNN, they've had Nikki Haley's, Chris Christie's, all these other people on a town hall platform. So they thought, in fairness, that they needed to provide a very sort of a very similar format for Donald Trump. But anyone who knows Donald Trump knows and recognized that the complexion of the audience could see that could have turned out really horribly. And I think there's been other reporting that CNN was fearful that Trump was going to just walk off the stage and that would become an embarrassment. So they might have, overcompensated. I don't have direct reporting on that. I want to be very clear. I don't want to assume something's true if I, can't vouch for the credibility of the sources. But it did feel like that they gave Donald Trump way too long of a leash on that.
So, Meg, I want to ask you for your speculation or your opinion on this. It sounds like the town, you told us, was very upset about the way the town hall was handled. And I know we're trying to predict here, but if it wasn't all just Trump voters and the governor of New Hampshire, John and I are both from New Hampshire, so we know these type of voters. The governor of New Hampshire said they were all Trump supporters. He knew a lot of them in the room. But if they weren't all Trump supporters and they were genuine independents and they weren't cheering on Trump, mocking and deriding E. Jean Carroll and all the other deplorable things that were happening, do we think that the town hall would have been perceived differently by the talent at CNN, or would it have still been panned because they gave Trump a platform?
I think Anderson Cooper tried to answer that question post-debate, where he talked about how it was necessary for CNN to give a platform to all the various candidates, that's what CNN was trying to do. So I think that internally they felt that the goal was valid and noble, but the execution was off.
I think an interesting dynamic that you've touched on, Meg, is that even though CNN were sort of bending over backwards to appease the Trump supporters in this instance, the Trump supporters are still cheering all the attacks on CNN in the meantime. And I think that this might be partly because the consumers don't know about programming decisions. They don't know the men behind the camera. They don't know about Chris Licht. They don't know about David Zaslav. They don't know about AT&T and Jeff Zucker and Discovery. What they see are the on-screen talent. When they think about CNN, they think about Jake Tapper, Anderson Cooper, and Don Lemon. And if Chris Licht really wanted to remake the reputation and perception of the network, it would have required a more significant talent shakeup. And the Atlantic article really touches on this. They really hone in on the decision to put Don Lemon on the morning show, which was going to be Chris's signature show, putting on one of the most polarizing and most partisan left-leaning hosts on that program. It's completely confounding. And I'd like to hear, Meg, if you think that a bigger talent shakeup was necessary and might be in the offing.
Might be in the offing, probably not at this point, because they're still dealing with the fallout of getting rid of Chris Cuomo. And I also think that there are a lot of journalists, like, for instance, Jim Acosta. He's a tremendous broadcaster and someone who was really an irritant to Donald Trump. He's shown that, that you can be both, actually. And so I think that a greater talent shakeup, no, I think the problem right now is they need to figure out how to lift the fortunes of their primetime network and what type of smart programming will do that. Because again, I fundamentally believe that some of the people that they're trying to appeal to are people who are, happy to be watching The Office reruns or other really great programming, and they won't be there every night, day in and day out. So do I think, I guess no, not really. And I also think that the way that the Don Lemon situation was handled was not a good look for CNN either.
I think really kind of at the heart of this whole conversation is the impossibility of solving these problems, and how no matter what you do with programming, even if some of this was poorly executed, the fundamentals of the cable business are just contracting, and the walls are really closing on the entire model. I mean, there was a story, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal recently, about how ESPN are considering offering a standalone service that's much more than what they have with their current ESPN Plus. It's in fact a stream of everything that they're offering on their linear programming, with all the high profile games and matches, SportsCenter, and so on. And I'm thinking about how we've gone from a few years ago where the cable bundle was such a big part of the architecture of the industry to where it's really just a few 2x4s being stuck together with chewing gum. And Meg, where do we go from here for cable news? I mean, will we look back at cable news as something that was an interesting era of media that lasted for 30 years, that had its time and place? I mean, is there even a future for this business at all?
Oh, I think there is. But I think you're right. 10 years ago, I think the number was 100 million cable TV homes in America. And now the losses have been huge. It's like 6% a year. And I think it's down to in the low 70s, maybe even high 60 million subscriber homes. When you say that the cable TV universe was sort of a foundation of the industry, it was the financial foundation. The money that these programmers, the channel owners, the CNN owners, the USA Network, Bravo, TNT, you name it, MTV, that their strength, their financial strength has long been the cable fees that they get from the cable companies, the Charters and Spectrum and Comcasts and Cox, cables of the world. So that is the big problem facing media, is they're losing these subscribers at far too fast of a clip to be able to replicate the revenue that comes from the streaming audience. I think that was what they were trying to do at Warner Discovery with CNN Plus. The problem was they couldn't have a live stream of what cable TV viewers saw. That wasn't part of the contracts, because the people that who are paying them all this money, the cable TV providers, they want that exclusive product on their channels to keep their subscribers, right? So CNN Plus was seen as sort of like a bridge to the future, but the Warner Brothers Discovery, and they probably had a point, was like, documentaries weren't going to cut it when they thought they were getting CNN Plus, they thought it was going to be the live feed and more. So you can see why they felt that it was too much out there in terms of getting us to the future. But you got to plan for the future today. You can't wait for 10 years when people, when the cable TV universe is at, 35 or 40 million. I think the other issue inherent in your question is the cable TV audience is an older audience because, older people, stay in one place. They, many of them are more financially stable. And so, you have an aging audience, and how do you bridge that divide to younger people who are much more content to download an app or listen to a podcast?
The other thing that kind of confounded me a little bit about the CNN Plus concept, and this also applies to Fox Nation, is that the streaming services of that type are built in an on-demand viewing model. And the cable news is about live viewing. And Meg, you talked about the idea that maybe eventually, or the audience was expecting that they could get a live stream of the linear channel. And I don't know, maybe that's appealing. But I wonder if, as the digital connectivity is changing our habits so much, people will be looking for the live hits through social media and by checking a news website, not to kind of sit down and watch live news. And then when we've got the on-demand programming, which are documentaries, I don't know if news programming is really meant to be consumed that way, because you want, something becomes dated almost immediately. The on-demand viewing that's been successful for, to a certain extent for Netflix and the other entertainment streamers. I mean, it's material that you can watch a week after it would have broadcast, and it's still good to watch. But a news program, it becomes dated right away. So can it ever really work in an on-demand system?
That's an excellent point. But media consumption is also a habit. And when you get out of the habit of reading a daily newspaper or turning on, your favorite programming while you get ready for work, that's when, that's when the real trouble begins for these media companies, because they're built their businesses on the habits of viewers and readers. And I think that that is a story that is being told in real time.
Certainly the challenge that we've seen in cinemas. I mean, as we've conditioned people to stay at home to watch something because of the shorter exclusivity windows after the 90-day wall was shattered during the pandemic when everything was being released day and date. I mean, we've conditioned people to get out of the habit of going to cinema to see a movie. And I mean, that's just like with the cable bundle, chipping away at the architecture of the entire industry in a way that's sort of existential.
Oh, it is. And that is the crisis facing all of these legacy media companies, is how can they possibly replicate the revenue that they've grown so used to from the cable TV model when viewers' behavior has really radically shifted. And while they're trying to keep up with that shift, they're spending billions of dollars to try to sustain their businesses. But on the other end, not making nearly the profits that they thought they were going to make.
Yeah, it's interesting. And now I'm just bringing it back to my bugaboo, which is sports, and sports attendance is up across the board. So I wonder why, this isn't your bailiwick maybe, but I wonder why sports is rebounding, yet the movie theater isn't.
Two things. One is the experiential factor of live sports is huge. And you look at the ratings on, the networks. I mean, particularly football, soccer's doing really well. You have consumers that will spend dearly to go to a game. And some of these same, sports fans will get their little quick hits with, just clips that they see online, and they won't watch an entire game, but going to the game is still really a huge part of their lives. They're bonding, it's generational. you can hear the stories of, the young kid who, his granddad and dad took him to a baseball game. And so they want to share that experience with their sons and daughters. And so you have this affinity for sports that you don't have in a lot of other realms. I think that we're seeing, the trends that movies are starting to do better, but they're the blockbuster movies. And that's, what people will pay more to go see rather than a rom-com or, sort of a feature about, just sort of a drama. But I think that, as people feel more comfortable going into large spaces, we will likely see a rebound in the theater going. It probably won't be to the level that it was before the pandemic, but frankly, the numbers of moviegoers going out to the cinema was going down even before the pandemic.
Since 1939, I think, right, Meg?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I mean,
cinema's peaked a long time ago, but it's been.
John would know this stat. He's a movie nerd.
I think you'll see a spike with Titanic in 1997 or whatever.
1997, yeah. I think that when TV got introduced in the 50s, that was the first hit, and now another one with streaming. But Gone with the Wind, I adjusted. It's like 1.8 billion, something like that, twice as much as anybody can make today.
John, you sound like Trump bringing up Gone with the Wind.
That was peak Hollywood.
There's this big writer's strike. There's so much to cover. We probably will have to have you back to explain it all to us and our listeners who are really focused on media and politics, maybe not the back end machinations with the writers. But does this end anytime soon, or is it going to be a showdown where both sides are entrenched and there's going to be some pain felt?
I just find that the writers' strike situation is really a microcosm of some of the labor movement that we're seeing across the country. People just feel like, why are these guys at the top making all the money while we're working so hard and we're barely, squeaking by? Will the writers' strike end soon? I don't think it's going to end before July. And there's also a possibility that the actors will go out on strike as well. Should that happen, I mean, production will shut down. The Writers Guild strike has shut down a lot of production, even shows that had their scripts written because the Teamsters don't want to cross the picket line. The directors were able to negotiate a new deal with the media companies, which the producers. One of the realities for both sides is that the contracts that the media companies have extended to a whole host of writers, the showrunners, over the last few years have a clause in them that allows the media company to cancel the contract if there is an event that's greater their control, the force majeure clause. That means that for now, a lot of these media companies don't have an incentive to go back to the table to work out a deal because they can sort of rid their books of some of the deals that haven't worked out, are not productive, and they can save money. So because of that contractual sort of window that doesn't open until the end of June, I think that means that the writer's strike will continue at least into July. And a lot of people are saying it's going to last a lot longer. Should the actors go on strike, that would be in July. And that would, cause a tremendous amount of disruption. And think about it. It's also hurting some of the platforms that are, starving for viewers and the broadcasters. I mean, they don't have their late night hosts. There's talk that the fall season might start in January. I mean, you're also giving viewers another reason not to consider you as part of the media habit. So there's a lot of destruction that will likely come should this strike be even more prolonged than what we're anticipating that it will be.
So, Meg, I mean, this has been a great discussion. We've been talking about the crisis of sorts at CNN, but it's really a time of crisis in the entire industry in a way, for entertainment, for news, for the business of television, for the business of cinemas, for the business of streaming services. So We're very glad to have had you on to break all of this down, and we look forward to seeing what direction all of this goes in the months and weeks ahead.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. And I do think that in the next, 4, 5, 6 years, we're going to look back at 2023 and say that this was such a pivotal year because of all of the turbulence that's in the industry right now. And not everybody's going to survive. And, we're starting to see the winners and losers shake out in real time.